The year was 1855, and Indiana's Wabash County stretched wide and silent, its land broken only by fences, dirt tracks, and rows of stubborn crops leaning in the wind. On one such road, far from the bustle of town, stood a large wooden house with a porch that sagged at its center. To those who passed by on horseback or wagon, it seemed a picture of ordinary life, a boarding house run by a respectable widow. Smoke rose steadily from its chimney, carrying the smell of boiled corn and roasted meat, a comfort to travelers who had spent days in the open air. The woman who kept it, Marjorie Kellum, was known in whispers and passing remarks. They called her dutiful, charitable, and pious. She had buried her husband young, raising her only child to adulthood before he too had vanished into distant work. To the world, she was a figure wrapped in faith and quiet service, a woman who smiled with modest warmth and greeted strangers with folded hands. To those who entered her home, she seemed almost maternal. Yet even as she offered hospitality, her eyes carried something colder, watchful, as though she was not seeing guests as people but as arrangements, as forms to be studied and kept still. Travelers along the Wabash Trail often found themselves desperate for rest, and the Kellum boarding house was a sanctuary for those with little coin and weary bones. The long parlor smelled faintly of candle wax and iron, and in its corner rested a thick family Bible whose spine had long ago stiffened with overuse. Marjorie would open it at meals, reading softly with her lips moving but no sound escaping, as though the words were too holy for the ears of men. Guests rarely questioned her peculiar silence, for they were too grateful for bread, stew, and the promise of a dry bed. At night she would glide through the hallways, lantern in hand, the light sliding across the floorboards like a watchful eye. Some would stir awake at the sound of her steps and feel her presence at their door, lingering, as though she were counting the rhythm of their breathing before moving on. What no guest could see was how carefully the house itself had been altered. Beneath the rug of the dining room, boards had been cut and fitted with a hinge, the seams nearly invisible in the candlelight. In the cellar, chains had been set into the stone, and hooks hammered into beams that bore the stains of age and something darker. These changes were never spoken of, not even in Marjorie's own mind. She had learned long ago that silence was stronger than words, and that concealment was its own form of worship. She dressed her hidden work with layers of domestic normalcy. Embroidered curtains, hymnals on shelves, the faint perfume of lavender pressed into linens. All of it was camouflage, a disguise for what the house was meant to be. Marjorie's faith was peculiar, shaped not by the sermons of her church but by something older, a hunger that had nested in her thoughts since girlhood. She believed that noise was the language of corruption, that human voices carried chaos, lies, and rebellion. Her obsession was with silence, not the peaceful silence of prayer, but the silence carved into flesh, the silence imposed upon the unwilling. To her, every traveler who came through her door was another chance to practice devotion, another offering to a God she had fashioned in her own mind. Her prayers were not spoken, they were performed. And each performance required a guest. The townsfolk of Wabash only saw the surface. They noted her neat appearance, her precise gestures, her unwavering attendance at services. When she passed through the market, she bought little. Flour, salt, candles, always in measured amounts. Her neighbors saw loneliness in her eyes, but what they mistook for grief was calculation, a constant surveying of the world around her. She was not mourning her losses, she was rehearsing her control. Every day she perfected the art of appearing harmless. Every night she perfected something else entirely. There were evenings when the prairie grew quiet, when even the crickets stilled, and the lamp in her upper window remained lit past midnight. Those were the nights when she prepared. She would set the table with care, polishing the spoons until she could see her reflection bend and twist in their curves. She laid out the same cup at every setting, the one with the faint crack near the rim, for it was the cup she always filled last. In its base, invisible to the naked eye, was the faint trace of the powder she used to weaken the body and cloud the mind. It was her ritual of welcome, the first step in turning a guest from traveler to captive. In the stillness of those nights, Marjorie Kellum was not a widow, not a hostess, not a grieving woman of faith. She was something altogether different, an instrument of silence, patient and precise. The road that led to her door seemed innocent, stretching across fields and fences like any other. But to those who entered her home, it was a road with no return. And as the year unfolded, the house on that quiet stretch of Wabash County would gather more than travelers. It would gather secrets, buried deep beneath the wood and stone, where no prayer could reach and no voice would ever rise again. By daylight, the Kellum boarding house appeared almost holy in its simplicity. The windows were always polished, catching the pale Indiana sun and scattering it across the dirt path that led to the porch. The wooden cross above the doorway, hand-carved and worn, gave the impression of a place rooted in Christian duty. Inside, shelves lined with hymnals and well-thumbed scripture offered comfort to those who feared the uncertainty of travel. Guests who entered often remarked on how safe they felt, how the air seemed cleaner, quieter, touched by devotion. To them, Marjorie Kellum was a gift on the lonely road, a motherly figure who asked little in return beyond respect and prayer. She moved through her house with calculated grace, her presence both calming and commanding. When she set the table, every placement had meaning. The Bible open to Psalms, the candles trimmed evenly, the single chipped cup standing among the rest of the crockery. She always served her guests herself, ladling the stew with a steady hand, offering bread she had baked before dawn, and blessing the food in silence with her head bowed low. Some found her quiet, unsettling, but most mistook it for humility. They believed she had suffered much in her life and carried her grief inwardly, allowing God alone to hear her words. None could see that her silence was not grief at all. It was worship of another kind. Her prayers, though never spoken aloud, were rituals performed with frightening precision. Before serving a meal, she dipped her fingers in water and touched the rim of each guest's plate as though sealing it. She traced the sign of the cross not upon her chest but upon the table, her hand pressing hard into the wood until the skin reddened. When the plates were cleared, she always made certain each guest drank from the same vessel at least once, the vessel with the faint crack running through its rim. They believed it was merely the house cup, the one that had endured through years of use. In truth, it was her chosen instrument, a tool of control that carried more than water or wine. To Marjorie, it was the chalice of her altar. The home itself hummed with deceptive warmth. At night, the hallways carried faint strains of hymns, not sung by her voice, but played softly on a wind-up box she had acquired years before. Its sound was uneven, the notes dragging and bending, yet to weary travelers it was soothing. They felt themselves lulled by the tune, unaware that its repetition was designed to wear down their guard. The melodies served as a mask, cloaking the strange sense of unease that sometimes stirred in the walls. If a guest ever noticed the faint marks near the door frames, as though nails had once been hammered deep, they said nothing. If they caught her watching them with unblinking intensity as they sipped from the cracked cup, they explained it away as the attentiveness of a hostess. Her piety extended beyond meals. She insisted her guests pray before sleep, kneeling beside their beds as she hovered in the doorway with hands clasped. She would listen not to their words but to the cadence of their breath, noting who prayed quickly and who lingered. Her eyes searched for weakness, for doubt, for voices that trembled in fear. In her mind, these were signs of corruption, symptoms of the noise she despised. Each guest was a test, an offering waiting to be purified, and she alone was chosen to decide their worth. Travelers often left letters of praise in her guest book, a thick volume that sat on a table in the parlor. Their words told of kindness, good food, a godly home. Yet some wrote of dreams that troubled them in the night, dreams of hands pressing on their mouths, dreams of voices that tried to cry out but made no sound. They left these comments half in jest, never believing they meant anything, never suspecting that their subconscious had brushed against the truth hidden beneath the floor. To Marjorie, those dreams were confirmation that her work was reaching them, seeping into their minds like smoke. Her pattern was so careful, so measured that no one dared call it strange. The chipped cup was explained away as tradition. The silent blessings were admired as humility. The strange hymnal box was regarded as quaint. But in every detail, Marjorie was building the same performance over and over, rehearsing the transformation of strangers into something more than guests. Each gesture was part of her devotion to silence, each ritual a brick in the structure she was constructing in her mind. A temple not of stone but of stillness, where voices would be hushed forever. Those who left the Kellum house never carried suspicion with them. They spoke of her warmth, her care, her prayers, and her faith. They spread her reputation along the Wabash Trail, ensuring more weary travelers found their way to her door. To the world, Marjorie Kellum was innocent itself, a beacon of safety on a lonely road. Yet under that facade of scripture and song, something else was growing, a hunger for order that demanded more than appearances. It demanded sacrifice, and soon the rituals of hospitality would no longer be enough to keep the silence she worshipped. Elias Harper came up the Wabash Road with a satchel of tinware that chimed at his thigh. A thin man with careful hands and a habit of tracing letters in the air when no one watched. He had left a promise behind him, a wife and a small daughter in Ohio who believed the trade would carry them through winter. And he counted each mile as proof that love could be kept by work. By the time he reached the Kellum boarding house, his boots were dusted white and his head ached, but the windows shone and the porch light held still. Marjorie Kellum greeted him with folded hands and a mild smile, a widow of faith who offered stew, bread, and a bed the way a church offers a pew. She prayed without sound before they ate and touched the rim of each plate, then insisted he drink water from a cracked cup she called the house cup. The water tasted clean, but a soft dullness moved through his limbs like warm cloth. The parlor hummed with a bent hymn from a wind box, its tune slow and even, the sort of song that makes a person loosen inside. She showed him a tidy room with a heavy rug and set his satchel by the bed, then wished him rest. He slept as soon as he lay down, and that was her first mercy, because she preferred obedience that felt chosen. After midnight, the bed began to breathe downward, not with a jerk, but with the patience of a careful hand. The rug parted along a hidden seam and the floor opened like a quiet lid. He did not fall. The bed lowered on ropes that ran through pulleys wrapped in oiled cloth, and the machine offered no sound to carry upstairs. Leather straps hung from a wooden frame in the center of the room, not torn or crude, but polished smooth by many hands. Marjorie came down the steps as though starting morning bread, calm and exact, with the gaze of someone measuring a task. She checked his pulse and counted his breaths against the clock, then raised a finger to signal quiet as if he had asked for it. A thin brace slid between his teeth, padded with cloth, and a narrow reed ran from it to a silent bellows. When she pressed the lever, the bellows moved air through him and made his chest rise, not to help him breathe, but to set the rhythm that belonged to her. She covered his eyes with folded cloth and pressed wax at the rims of his ears, not to injure, but to take choice away. He could breathe and he could feel, but his senses were in her hands. Noise, she believed, was a sickness the soul carried, and stillness was the cure. Elias tried to speak, and only a breath shaped against the brace. She patted his hand as if to thank him for agreeing. She unwound a ribbon of fine wire from his satchel and looped it behind his teeth so the jaw would not close on the tube. She tested his startle with a shake of dry beans and marked her book when his eyes flinched under the cloth. She tightened each strap by a measured notch whenever he lifted a finger. Hours passed like oil, slow and smothering. When his thoughts cleared, he sought his tools the way a man seeks his name. She watched his gaze slide toward the stairs and understood. She brought his engraving tool from the satchel, the sharp point he used to carve initials into tin kits for fairs. She pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers on it as if teaching prayer. She guided his hand to the underside of a loose stairboard and helped him carve his name there, small and neat. She did not do this to free him. She did it to make him part of the house. When the carving was done, she took a nail and pinned the tool beneath the board. The wood swallowed the metal like a secret set in a tooth. He felt the tap echo in his ribs, one bright note that no one would hear again. When she judged him, she measured a powder into water and let it slide past the brace. His limbs softened and his will went smooth. She raised the bed by the same quiet ropes and covered the seam with the rug. She straightened his shirt, set his boots by the wall, and opened the window to make a draft that smelled like dawn. She arranged the room to tell a simple lie. A traveler rose early and walked on. The lie held steady. Then she sat at the table with his satchel and began the second half of the ritual, which took place in letters. Elias kept a notebook of orders and a page where he practiced names before cutting metal. His script leaned right and favored thin crosses on the T. She copied the hand and wrote to Ohio with quiet care. She said the roads were kind, the pay small but steady, and he would be home before spring. She folded the paper and pressed it with the edge of his own token as if he had sealed it. In the morning, she walked to the post and mailed it. Somewhere far away, a woman would read comfort, and comfort would become a wall that kept questions out. Later that week, a neighbor asked after the tinsmith. Marjorie said he prayed over his bread and left before dawn, a good man with good manners, and she looked down as if missing him. She kept his satchel for parts, sorting wire and fasteners into careful rows. At night, she paused on the stair landing and touched the board where the tool lay pinned. She did not pray aloud. In her mind, the touch was a vow. Elias Harper's name traveled east on paper while his breath had been counted in a cellar. No law had been broken that anyone could see. A letter was proof, and proof is a kind of sleep when people want to rest. Marjorie moved through her rooms with the same modest grace as before, a widow of faith, a neighbor, a hostess. But inside, a new hunger tightened. The order tasted good. She drew a small bird with its beak sewn shut in her ledger and wrote a word she preferred to dead, stilled. The first vanishing felt almost gentle compared to what would come because first acts must teach before they punish. Now she knew how to teach without raising her voice, how to make absence look like choice, how to keep a soul from echoing. By dawn, the road waited empty again, and the house, content, held its breath for the next polite knock outside. By the time a second year had passed since the disappearance of Elias Harper, Marjorie Kellum's rituals had grown sharper, more deliberate, and coldly exact. What began as an instinct, a hunger cloaked in faith, was now a system, an order that could be repeated, perfected, and hidden under the folds of hospitality. Her home, once a simple boarding house, had turned into a stage designed for one performance only, the act of silencing. Every part of the house now carried her logic. The cracked cup was no longer a convenience but an instrument. Into it she measured a powdered tonic made from herbs and minerals she had ground herself, a mixture that dulled the muscles and clouded the will but left the victim's body alive, pliable, and steady. Guests would drink, thanking her for her kindness, unaware that the liquid was a binding prayer meant to steal their freedom. She never hurried the dose. It slid into them as patience does, unnoticed, until their fingers loosened around utensils and their breath became slow. The floor itself had become her ally. Under the rug of the dining room and in the chambers where guests slept, she had fitted boards with concealed hinges, pulleys, and weighted ropes. Every nail was hammered with purpose, every joint sanded to silence. She tested them by walking back and forth in the dead of night, ensuring no creak betrayed the trap. When her guests lay still from the tonic, she would guide them gently to bed, or sometimes she would allow them to slump into their chairs. It mattered little. Once their heads sagged and their limbs failed to obey, she worked the pulley system with the ease of someone lifting bread from an oven. The bodies did not drop. They descended slowly, soundlessly, as if the house itself was swallowing them whole. No thud, no struggle, no cry. The Kellum home had become a mouth, and she was the tongue guiding the food down. Below the floor was the true heart of her devotion, the cellar. Here, order became ritual. She did not strike her victims or leave them broken. To her, violence was clumsy, noisy, and wasteful. What she craved was control, the shaping of life into a form that matched her worship of silence. Once strapped into her wooden frame, the guests were not left to rot. They were taught. She bound them with leather that smelled of oil and smoke, straps polished from use until they gleamed in lantern light. Each strap had its notch, each notch its meaning. She adjusted them until breath came only at her pace. And here she began what she called her chorus. A crude bellows, scavenged from farm tools, had been modified with reeds and narrow tubing. She fixed the tube between their teeth, securing the jaw with clamps so they could neither spit it out nor close against it. Then, with a steady push of her hand, she forced air into their lungs. Their chests rose, their throats quivered, and a faint wheeze emerged, not a scream, not speech, but the hollow sound of breath stretched into song. She called it their hymn. To her, each wheeze was proof that noise could be mastered, reshaped into something she controlled. They were not crying out anymore. They were singing under her hand, unwilling but obedient. The ritual never stopped at breath alone. She took wax and dripped it near their ears, hardening into plugs that muted all sound except their own struggling wheeze. She wrapped blindfolds not just to cover their eyes but to press deep into their sockets, making darkness feel permanent. Sometimes she stitched the cloth to their lids with fine thread, small piercings that left no chance of light. Their tongues, if they dared to move against the tube, she pierced with sharp needles until swelling made speech impossible. Each act was not cruelty in her mind, but correction, the removal of corruption, the stripping away of noise. She saw herself as a purifier, chosen to carve silence into the bodies of those who carried the disease of voice. Her ledger reflected this order. She wrote no names, only marks and symbols, each one a line in the psalm she was composing with flesh. A circle meant one hymn completed, a triangle meant eyes sealed, and the bird with a sewn beak marked the final silence. These entries replaced death records, for to her they were not dead but perfected, stilled into eternity. She prayed through their bodies rather than her own voice, and each night the cellar filled with the sound of air moving through unwilling throats, a choir of sighs that belonged to no one but her. Marjorie carried herself upstairs as if nothing had shifted. She served breakfast, she wrote letters in borrowed hands, she sat in church pews with folded palms. No one saw that she had become a conductor of silence, her house transformed into an instrument of worship. Every visitor thought themselves safe, seated in a home draped with scripture and the smell of bread. Yet each guest was already mapped in her mind, another note in her hymn, another body to be pressed into stillness. What began with Elias Harper as a trembling experiment had now become a method, flawless and repeatable. Marjorie had learned that silence could be taught through design, that the body itself could be turned into a tool of worship. And as her cellar filled with the faint, forced chorus of breath, she no longer questioned whether she was right. She believed the proof surrounded her, bound in straps and darkness, singing without choice. Each night the Kellam house rested above its hidden choir, a place of hymns not heard by the world but by the only God she served, the God of silence. And outside, the prairie stayed quiet, as if it too had agreed to keep her secret. The cellar of the Kellam boarding house no longer smelled of potatoes or root vegetables as it once had. It smelled of iron, wax, and damp cloth, a place where light struggled to survive. Here Marjorie Kellam carried out what she called her refinement, though no guest ever saw it and no neighbor could have guessed it. What others might think of as murder, she understood as sacred work, the patient collapse of the senses until nothing remained but stillness. Violence to her was loud and wasteful. A scream was disorder, and blood sprayed in anger was chaos. She wanted something cleaner, a death without noise, a devotion written in silence. The cellar was laid out like a chapel. The wooden frame with its leather straps stood in the center like an altar. Candles burned not for light but for ritual, their wax serving a darker purpose once cooled. She bound her captives with practiced ease, every strap tightened until limbs could not shift even an inch. The tonic in their bodies left them heavy but aware, trapped inside their own weight. She always began with the eyes. To her, vision was arrogance, the sense that believed it could master the world. She pressed cloth across their lids, then threaded a fine, curved needle dipped in vinegar through the edges of skin. With small, deliberate stitches, she sealed their eyelids together. The thread cut no deeper than needed, but the sensation was enough to make them shiver until exhaustion silenced them. In her mind, she was not harming them. She was taking away the sin of sight, removing distraction, forcing them inward. Once vision was gone, she turned to hearing. She melted wax from her candles and let it drip into their ears, not scalding but sealing, a warm plug that hardened into permanent muteness. She worked slowly, tilting the head, ensuring the wax cooled in the canal. When it hardened, the world outside ceased. They could no longer hear her breath or their own wheeze through the tube. They were left in a tomb of their own silence, and to Marjorie this was mercy. She whispered prayers they could not hear, believing the words sank into their flesh instead. The mouth, she thought, was the most dangerous part of the body. The tongue lied, cursed, and carried the noise of rebellion. To correct it, she pierced it with slender needles, one after another, until swelling filled the mouth with pain too thick for words. She left the tube wedged between their teeth so the body could breathe, but the tongue could no longer shape sound. Sometimes she tied the jaw with wire to keep it from moving, locking the face into a permanent hush. She recorded each step in her ledger with care, symbols that meant more to her than any written name. A circle for eyes, a mark for ears, a dash for tongue. Each victim became a hymn, recorded not in ink alone but in her memory of their stillness. What she created in that cellar was not a dungeon of screams but a vault of quiet bodies, each stripped of the senses that once betrayed them. They no longer saw, they no longer heard, they no longer spoke. All that remained was breath, drawn and released under her command, a choir of air that moved like sighs beneath the earth. At night she would sit among them, lantern dim, and listen to their forced chorus. To outsiders, it might have been wheezing or gasps of pain, but to her it was holy music, a sound without words, a hymn without meaning, shaped only by obedience. She called it her choir of the mute, and she believed it was proof that silence was stronger than life itself. The cellar became her sanctuary. Each wall absorbed the weight of her work, every stone soaked in the presence of lives undone not by rage but by method. She believed the earth itself welcomed the offering, that the soil pressed close around the foundation to guard her secret. Above ground she was a widow of faith, a hostess who served bread and water. Below she was a priestess of stillness, building a congregation that would never rise or speak again. In the shadows of her cellar, she convinced herself she was not killing. She was transforming, shaping flesh into silence, building a vault where the noise of the world could not intrude. And each new body strapped to the frame made her more certain that she was chosen for this work. By the time the cellar grew full, Marjorie no longer feared discovery. The house had become more than shelter. It was a living instrument, a mouth that swallowed voices, a chapel that sang in sighs. To those who came to her door, she was kind. To those carried below, she was finality. And in her ledger of symbols, she marked each one not as dead, but as stilled. By 1857, the Wabash Trail had become a road of disappearances. Men who had left their homes with wagons of trade goods or tools for labor never returned. Their families wrote letters to towns along the route, their names spoken in post offices, taverns, and markets, but always the trail seemed to end somewhere near Marjorie Kellum's lonely house. A tinsmith, a cooper, a school teacher seeking new work, a farmhand traveling for pay, all vanished as if the road had swallowed them whole. A dozen men, maybe more, were spoken of in whispers, each one reduced to rumor. Each family left with letters that did not quite ring true. And still, when neighbors glanced at Marjorie, they saw nothing more than a widow devoted to her church and her God. Marjorie understood that suspicion was as dangerous as discovery, and she guarded against it with careful performances. She was never late to Sunday service. She carried her Bible pressed against her chest with trembling hands, her face lowered in pious humility. She donated flour, candles, and coins to the parish, always more than she seemed able to afford, and insisted it was from her husband's memory, a gift in his honor. To the sick, she brought broth. To the grieving, she whispered comfort. She sat with neighbors as they worried over the vanished men, tilting her head in sympathy, murmuring that the world was growing crueler, that the roads were no longer safe. Her tone was steady, her eyes bright with shared grief, and no one saw the truth behind them. But her house told a different story. In her ledger, a thick book bound in brown leather, she did not write names. She wrote verses drawn from hymns but twisted into code only she could understand. Each line appeared holy to the casual glance, words of praise and scripture copied with a firm hand. Yet hidden in the cadence was a different record. The arrival of each guest, the date of their stillness, the details of their correction. She never once used the word death. Death to her was common and meaningless. What she pursued was more sacred. Each man was stilled. Each soul had been pressed into silence, refined into the form she worshipped. At the end of every entry, she drew her mark, a small bird, its wings folded, its beak stitched shut with a single line of ink. The bird became her seal, the emblem of her devotion. To her, it was not a sign of cruelty, but of completion. A bird with an open beak was chaos, song and chatter loosed into the world. A bird sewn shut was pure, a creature freed from noise, eternal in its silence. That symbol grew across the pages until the ledger became a psalter of the mute, a book of hymns written not in music but in absence. The whispers in the countryside grew heavier. Some muttered of thieves along the road, others of accidents in the wild. Families traveled to Wabash County searching for traces of their missing sons and brothers. They asked at inns and blacksmith shops, and the name Kellum sometimes surfaced. Someone had said the tinsmith stayed at her place, another that a preacher once dined there. But Marjorie's reputation stood as a wall against such doubts. The church elders praised her devotion, and the poor blessed her gifts. Who could accuse a woman so faithful, so generous? Even the sheriff, when questions reached him, dismissed them as the misfortune of travel. He told families the Wabash Road was long and dangerous, that storms, sickness, or thieves explained what they feared. Marjorie herself fed the doubt with her own hand. She wrote letters in the script of the missing men, letters that spoke of opportunity, of roads yet to be traveled. Families received these letters weeks or months after their loved ones had vanished, and though unease lingered, the handwriting and details convinced them to wait. Waiting became silence, and silence became acceptance. She had learned to vanish not only the body but the voice. Yet the pattern was there for any who wished to see. Travelers vanished after passing through her stretch of the trail. Each story ended in the same invisible place, a dozen men gone without a trace, and all within reach of her quiet home. But neighbors looked at her bowed head, at the gifts she gave to the parish, at the way she knelt for longer than anyone else in prayer, and their suspicion dissolved. In her false humility, she had found the perfect disguise. Below her home, the cellar choir swelled. More straps tightened on more bodies, more wax cooled in ears, more threads sealed eyes, more needles stilled tongues. The air thickened with the steady wheeze of bellows forcing breath into lungs, creating the hollow chorus that lulled her into sleep. She heard not victims but voices of proof, reminders that her system worked, that her devotion was pure. Above ground, she sat in the front pew of her church, her eyes wet with feigned tears. Below ground, she sat among the stilled, her lantern light flickering across closed eyes and sealed mouths. Two worlds perfectly balanced, neither touching the other, both under her control. By the end of that year, the ledger held 12 birds, 12 marks of silence. To Marjorie, they were not 12 men lost, but 12 hymns completed. 12 offerings made to the God she served in secret. To the world, they were 12 mysteries swallowed by the road. And though whispers were carried in taverns and kitchens, no one dared point a finger at the widow whose prayers seemed endless, whose piety seemed unshakable. The pattern was written in ink and flesh, but the world chose not to read it. Josiah Crane came to the Kellum house at dusk, a lean preacher with a travel Bible in his coat and road dust in the seams of his boots, a man who knew the sound of false comfort because he had offered real comfort in rooms far colder than this one. The porch lamp burned steadily, and Marjorie met him with folded hands and a mild bow that looked like respect and felt like control. And he saw how her eyes did not search his face so much as measure it. Inside the parlor smelled of tallow and soap. Yet beneath the hymn candles a flat bite of lye rode the air, not sharp enough to scare a common traveler, but clear to a man who washed the dead in winter and cleaned floors after fever. And he wondered why a widow used so much ash and lime when her home looked so clean. She blessed the stew without a voice, touched the edge of his plate as if sealing a promise, and set before him the cracked house cup that other men had accepted without thought. He lifted it, saw a faint bloom at the rim where liquid had dried like frost, and he only wet his lips. Then set the cup down and rubbed his fingers along the table to make the act look casual. The windbox in the corner hummed a slow bend of a hymn, notes that sagged and rose like a tired chest, and the room wanted his eyelids to fall closed. But he told his breaths to come long and steady, and he kept count the way he kept count at a bedside when a mother's pain ran through the night. Marjorie showed him the guest room and smiled with the patience of a nurse, yet he saw the rug did not lie in honest lines. A seam curved like a healed wound across the boards, and a knot in the wood had been planned thin as if to hide a hinge. He thanked her and sat on the bed with his boots still on, and when her steps faded down the hall, he pressed the heel of his hand into the rug and felt slack where there should have been only the floor. He folded his Bible open at Psalms, not to read but to mark his mind with order in case the cup had touched him, and he spoke the words inside himself like stakes driven into ground. His head felt warm, his arms light, and he knew the binding work of a powder that did not dull sense but loosened will, a mix someone had learned by patient trial. The lamp on the table shed a low amber circle, and within it dust drifted like slow snow, each speck moving to a draft he could not place until he realized the floor breathed a little under his feet as if air moved somewhere below. Then he heard it faint and wrong, a hollow push and draw like a bellows far away. Not the rhythm of one chest, but of many forced into the same time, and everything in him stiffened while his body tried to relax. When Marjorie returned with a second candle, he lowered his eyes to look harmless, and he let his shoulders sink as if the cup had begun its work, and she came closer, satisfied with the picture she had made. She touched the lamp, pinched it lower, and with one smooth motion she brushed the rug edge with her toe, and the seam opened like a quiet mouth, and the bed sighed downward an inch on ropes that did not squeak. He pushed up hard, and the bed dropped another inch, and he rolled toward the wall and seized the frame to hold himself, and the ropes checked and held and then yielded again to her weight on a hidden lever. He kicked, not wild but aimed, feeling with his heel for purchase, hearing the soft click of pulleys wrapped in cloth, and the room tilted as the bed eased toward a square of deeper dark that smelled of iron, oil, and the sick, sweet trace of old breath. He spoke one word in his mind to keep fear from breaking him, and then he moved, throwing himself off the bed before it cleared the cut boards, taking the bruise into his shoulder and the scrape into his palm, and he hit the floor hard enough to make the lamp flame jump. Marjorie did not gasp or shout. She stepped back as if he were a spilled bowl that could be wiped up, and her face stayed calm, as if every motion he made had already been planned by her hand. He lurched for the door and felt the room sway, not from weakness alone but from the give of the trap above a hollow. And then her tonic found its grip in his muscles and dulled his knees, and he dropped to one hand as the rug slid under him. She guided, she did not drag. She used the bed and the ropes to make his own weight betray him, lowering him not by force but by gravity that she had harnessed like a careful farmer using a river. The cellar opened around him like a well turned sideways, cool and close, and the lantern she carried threw a thin coin of light that slid over straps, buckles, and wood polished by touch, and over faces that were not faces anymore, only coverings stitched and sealed against light and sound. Wax sat like pale stones in ears. Thread glittered at eyelids where it crossed and crossed. Tongues swelled behind wedges of wood and iron, and the air moved to the same broken hymn he had heard above. Breath pushed by a crude machine that rose and fell under her hand. He saw clamps like bridles and reeds like straws, and marks on beams where wire had bitten and been removed, and he knew this was not madness in a fit, but a church that one person had built in secret where she was priest and choir and God at once. He turned to climb, and his foot found the rung, but her hand pressed at his back with a force that was not large but exact, and leather slid across his wrist and caught, and then his other wrist, and the straps closed by measured clicks he could count. He pulled until his chest burned, and she watched the clock and wrote a note in a book as if timing a treatment. And then she set the tube between his teeth and tapped the clamp so the jaw would hold the shape she wanted. The bellows answered her foot like a servant, and air came into him, and the sound that left him was not his own voice, but a soft reed held in a steady line. The sound of a man turned into a pipe that someone else played. He tried to choke the tube, to bite, to spit, but his mouth had no power left. The needle kiss to the tongue took that, and he tasted metal and salt and the oil from her tools, and he tasted lie thin in the air, and he understood why the candles upstairs had tried to hide it. He screamed through the only hole she had left to him, a sound that no longer held words, and it rose up the stair like a bird that could not open its beak, and it went out into the yard, across the dark field, and into the windows of neighbors who heard and told themselves it was a fox, a wind, or a dream. A man in a shack a quarter-mile away sat up and listened, and then lay down because he needed to rise before dawn. And a woman on the next farm put her hand on her child and said the storm was moving off. And the noise ran out of names and came back to the house that made it. Below, Marjorie tightened the straps another hole and smoothed his hair as if he were fevered, and her eyes were bright not with hate but with belief. And she whispered a silent prayer that he could not hear because hearing had no place in her temple. He counted the pushes of air because counting was the only thing that was his, and he set the count against the words of a psalm, and he tried to make the rhythm slip. To break the line she stood inside, but the machine knew only her pace. She opened her ledger and drew the small bird, wings folded, beak sewn, and under it she wrote a verse that looked like praise and meant only this: the 26th hymn now begun. He fixed his eyes on the edge of cloth pressed to his lids and felt the thread bite. And he pictured snow, and he pictured his own church with the cracked window where winter came through and made the sermon honest, and he told himself that light would find him again if he got even one breath that was his alone. But the cellar took him not in one rush, but in inches, the way cold water takes a man who stands in it too long and decides he can bear it, and the minutes turned to a hallway with no doors. And his voice, that thin reed, went on without him. Above, the lamp in the guest room burned low, and the seam in the rug pulled itself flat as if ashamed to have been seen. And the candles in the parlor ate their lye smoke and made the house smell clean again. The night closed around the Kellum place and held steady, and the fields gave back no answer, and the sky kept its weather to itself, and the road that had delivered him did not claim him back. When morning came, there would be a story ready for anyone who asked, a polite preacher who thanked his hostess and left before dawn to meet a soul in need. And there would be a letter soon after in his good hand saying the work called him west, and it would carry the proof people prefer to the truth they fear. For now he was a voice turned into a line on a page, a breath turned into a hinge that rose and fell to another will. And the house that learned to swallow men had learned to swallow a man who knew the signs. And that knowledge failed him because knowledge cannot stop a hand that never shakes. The cellar choir held him until the hour turned, and the widow of faith stood above him as calm as a woman with a broom. And the night made no move to help, and the neighbors turned their faces to the wall and slept, and the sound of his last honest cry thinned and disappeared into the wood. Somewhere far away a church door stood open to the frost, and a Bible lay on a table with a pressed flower inside, and no one turned the page, and the house on the Wabash held its breath for one more day of quiet before the ground itself decided to speak. He screamed, the sound crossed the fields, but doors stayed shut for the 26th that night too. In the spring of 1859, the Wabash turned violent. Rain fell for days without pause, flattening the fields and pulling down fences until whole acres blurred into swamp. The river swelled, its banks dissolving under the weight of water, tearing at the soil as though it meant to peel the land back to its bones. Houses near the low ground were abandoned as families fled to higher fields, but the Kellum place stood stubbornly against the storm, its porch light extinguished, its windows black. Marjorie Kellum was not seen in town that week. Her neighbors assumed she was weathering the flood in prayer, a widow keeping vigil. They could not imagine what the water was carrying away. The earth around her house softened until the cellar walls themselves began to weep. The careful seams of stone that held her secret bled into the soil, and the current clawed at the foundation, prying loose what had been buried. By the time the storm broke and the water retreated, a portion of ground near the house had collapsed inward, exposing what no hymn or prayer could disguise. A passerby, riding the road after the rain, saw timbers jutting from the mud like ribs and called others to look. What they found there would unmake every quiet story she had told. The vault beneath the Kellum home lay split open, its earth peeled away to reveal a chamber no one had known existed. Inside, even in ruin, the order was clear. Skeletons lay strapped to beams, their bones still cinched by cracked leather that had outlasted flesh. Wire coiled around spines and ribs, not to bind them in life, but to keep their remains in silence even in death. Some jawbones bore iron clamps fixed tight, the teeth fused together as though to punish the very thought of a scream. Others showed holes in the sockets where thread had passed, pulling lids together even as rot hollowed the face. They were not graves, not even murders in the common sense. They were relics of ritual, bodies kept as instruments of her worship, hidden in the earth until the river itself betrayed her. The sheriff stood among them with his hat crushed in his hands, unable to name what he saw. Townsfolk gathered in clumps, faces pale, their voices hushed. They whispered of devils, of curses, of witchcraft, but the truth was worse. It was human hands, patient and steady, that had made this. Each bone still told of restraint, each fracture of jaw and wrist a record of silence forced into being. The choir she had built in her cellar was gone now, the bodies reduced to husks, but the order of her cruelty endured untouched by time or water. Inside the house the scene was still. The parlor sat as though waiting for supper, chairs tucked neatly, the Bible open on the table to a single verse. "Be still, and know that I am God." The scripture book was soaked at the edges where rain had come through the window. The ink bled, but the verse still legible, as if chosen to survive. Upstairs the bed was made. The rug lay flat, but the rocking chair near the window stood tipped on its side as though abandoned in haste. Marjorie herself was nowhere. No footprints in the mud, no sign of her among the bodies below. It was as if the flood had taken her too, sweeping her away into the black water, carrying her beyond the reach of justice. The town could not speak her name without a shudder. Some wanted to believe she drowned, that the river had swallowed her the way she had swallowed others. Others whispered that she fled before the storm broke, sensing her secret would be revealed, her ledger and her house left behind as bait for those who came after. The truth of her end was never known. Only the wreckage remained, a vault of silence torn open by nature itself, a secret too heavy for the earth to hold any longer. Authorities gathered what they could. The bones were lifted from the straps and laid out in rows, though few could be identified. Families came with letters in hand, with names long whispered, hoping to find proof in the wreckage, but most left with only the knowledge that their lost had been here, used as offerings in a faith no church could claim. The sheriff closed the house, but no one argued when the townsfolk returned days later to burn it. The walls fell into themselves, the roof buckled, and the air filled with smoke that stung eyes and throats. They said the fire was not for justice, but for cleansing, though no flame could erase the image of bones bound in silence, mouths clamped forever shut. The Kellum boarding house became ash, but the unease did not vanish with it. For years after, children on the Wabash Road spoke of hearing faint hymns in the wind at night, breathy and thin like voices carried on a bellows. Farmers refused to build on the ground where the cellar had been, claiming the soil smelled of wax and iron when turned. And among the townsfolk, the verse left open in her Bible became a curse of its own, whispered by those who feared her shadow lingered. Be still. Marjorie Kellum had disappeared without judgment, leaving behind only the proof of her devotion. The storm had revealed her work, but it had not revealed her fate. And perhaps that was the greater terror. That evil so deliberate, so careful, could simply step off the page of history and walk into silence, unpunished, unseen, waiting for another road, another house, another place where neighbors would mistake calculation for piety. When the floodwaters receded and the vault beneath the Kellum house was laid bare, the town of Wabash was left with a truth too large to hide and too shameful to carry. There was no trial, no punishment, no chance for a hanging or confession. The woman at the center of it all had disappeared into the storm, leaving behind nothing but her ledger, her scripture book, and the cellar full of bound remains. The people could not find justice in her absence, so they sought it in fire. Within weeks, the boarding house was stripped of its doors and chairs, dragged to the square, and stacked into a pyre. Crowds gathered in silence as the wood was set alight, the flames lifting into the night as if meant to purify more than timber. Families of the missing men stood with folded arms, their grief drawn into hard lines on their faces, watching the fire consume what had once appeared a house of safety. Some wept openly, others stared without expression, as though the sight of burning boards could not balance the weight of what the cellar had held. From the ashes came laws. Local authorities, pressured by families across counties, declared that every lodging house must keep a register of names written in ink and signed by hand, so that no traveler could vanish without a trace again. Inns and boarding homes were required to report those who stayed more than a night, and strangers could not pass quietly through as before. The record spread beyond Indiana until the practice of guest registries became standard across much of the Midwest. What had been a small home hidden on the Wabash Trail had changed the way a state thought about safety, though no law could fill the graves left unnamed. Yet justice never touched Marjorie Kellum. Some believed she drowned in the flood, her body buried in mud along the river's bend. Others claimed they saw her weeks later in a town to the south, dressed as a churchwoman, her hair bound under a bonnet, her hands folded as though in prayer. The uncertainty bred stories that moved faster than facts. She became a figure of rumor, the widow who vanished into the air, the hostess who silenced guests not for money, not for vengeance, but for a devotion so twisted it could not be named. Children were warned not to linger at strange doors. Travelers told one another to watch for women who prayed too long or spoke too little. The name Kellum became a whisper, and with it a chill. Her ledger was read and studied, though most could not bear to speak of its marks. The verses looked holy until one knew their meaning. Then each line became an accusation, each symbol a headstone. The bird with the sewn beak, drawn over and over, haunted the imagination of every man who touched those pages. It was no longer a sign of correction to her readers. It was a symbol of what happens when kindness is taken at face value, when hospitality is trusted without question. Even in her absence, she controlled the silence, because no one could speak her story without lowering their voice. Folklore took root quickly. Farmers told of hearing faint hymns across the fields at night, voices thin and breathless as if carried on the wind. Children dared each other to walk to the burned clearing and stand where the cellar had been, claiming they felt the ground hum beneath them. Preachers used her tale as warning in sermons, proof that Satan wears the mask of devotion, but not everyone believed in demons. Some believed only in people, and that was worse. For the Kellum house proved that evil did not come with horns or fire. It came with folded hands, with warm bread, with a voice that asked for prayer before supper. It came with gestures of kindness so well rehearsed that no one thought to look beneath them. Marjorie Kellum was never caught, and perhaps that was why her story endured. Her face faded from memory, but her method remained in the minds of those who survived her time. She was remembered not for rage, not for greed, but for the calm certainty with which she erased others one by one, until the earth itself revealed her secret. And in that certainty was the lesson that chilled most of all, that evil can operate without fury, without noise, without warning, until the silence it craves swallows everything around it. The Kellum house was gone, reduced to ash, but its legacy lived in law, in folklore, and in fear. It lived in the way travelers wrote their names at inns, in the way neighbors whispered about women who prayed too much, in the way children walked faster past the place where the soil had caved. It lived in the way silence itself was no longer trusted, because silence had been her weapon, her altar, her God. And it leaves us with a question that has never been fully answered. How many more houses, how many more faces of kindness could be waiting with the same devotion hidden beneath? Evil does not always shout. Sometimes it waits with folded hands and an open door.